What's up guys, BIOBEAN here. So today we're going to be talking about scientific theory and how it applies to evolution. So let's get started. Alright, so what is a scientific theory? So there's two things that go into a scientific theory. So the first thing is that it must be testable. So what that means is that it must be a theory that we are able to measure. So something that is an example of not a testable theory is that there is a invisible spaghetti monster flying in the sky, but we are unable to see it, hear it, smell it, touch it, taste it. And there's nothing that we can do to measure that it exists, but I'm going to tell you that it exists. So that's a theory that isn't testable. There's no measure that we can do in order to test that that exists. The second thing that you need for a scientific theory is that it must be falsifiable. For a scientific theory to be accurate, it must also be falsifiable. So it must be able to be proven wrong. And generally, not only must it be able to be proven wrong, it must be able to be proven wrong with at least one observation or a single observation. So let's get into a bit of examples of some things that are not falsifiable. So an example of a non-falsifiable statement is something like the Loch Ness Monster is real. So while we could scour every inch of the earth and the depths of the ocean in order to find out whether the Loch Ness Monster really exists, so it's something that's testable, we can search everywhere and possibly find it, but it would require extensive evaluation in order to make that theory be wrong, so to disprove that theory. So a falsifiable statement must be something that is easily disproven as false. So something as simple as a single observation could disprove that statement. So that is something we can't see here, because if you didn't see it in the lake, then we would say that, well, you just didn't look hard enough. Maybe they were hiding, maybe they were sleeping. And you could always give a reason as to why you haven't found evidence to support the theory. So falsifiable statement must be something that can be easily disproven with a single observation. So let's get into some examples of what a falsifiable statement is. An example of a falsifiable statement is something like all swans are white. All that takes is a single observation of a black swan in order to disprove this statement. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how the definition of scientific theory applies to the idea and theory of evolution. So before we get into the theory of evolution, I wanted to go over a little bit about what a theory is versus a fact. So to go over a few definitions of a theory is assumption based on limited knowledge. So that is kind of more of a lay person's definition of what a theory is that we kind of assume things based on a little bit of information, and we then use a theory to explain something that we see. And a little bit more of a scientific explanation of a theory is it is a set of testable hypotheses that attempt to explain observations about the natural world. So we see that when you have an object large enough, it tends to pull things towards it. So we have now developed the theory of gravity in order to explain the fact that things with a lot of mass tend to pull things towards it. So that is that set of testable hypotheses that we use to explain an observation that we see. So now to get a little bit into a fact. The way that we differentiate between a theory and a fact in science is that a fact is really just a theory that has so much supporting evidence that would be absurd to deny that it was true. So it doesn't mean that necessarily 100% every aspect of the theory is true, but at the very least, there is something about it that just seems to, no matter what observation or what experiment we try to test it with, it always holds true. So it has so much evidence to support it that you couldn't deny that it is a fact. And the reason why this definition of fact exists is because there's no real way to disprove a hypothesis. So while we don't have any evidence to 100% confirm that the theory of gravity is true, there is just so much evidence to support our theory of gravity that when an object has enough mass that it will start pulling things towards it, that it can't be denied as a true statement. So it's something that just has so much evidence to support it. So now let's apply this concept to the theory of evolution. So the theory of evolution, according to Charles Darwin, states that populations change over time and that all organisms are related. So is this a theory or fact? So considering it's called the theory of evolution, you might suppose that it is a theory. So while it is a theory, that it is a set of testable hypotheses. So Darwin went around and he saw that there were fossils that looked very similar to humans or to organisms that live nowadays. And so that's where he kind of found that perhaps one came from the other. So that was a testable hypothesis that we have been able to carry out a variety of experiments in order to test, and those have been proven to be true. So not only is it a theory, and that is a set of testable hypotheses, it is also a fact, because there has been hundreds of years of research that has been done in order to validate these hypotheses, and we have found that time and time again, these theories turned out to be true. So that is why we consider evolution to be not only a theory, but also a fact. In the same way that we would consider gravity to also be a theory, in that it's never been 100% proven, but it is a fact because there is just so much evidence to support it, it would be ridiculous to say that it isn't true. So let's get a little bit into what is the evidence that we have seen for evolution. There's a few pieces of evidence for evolution that we're going to be going over that pertains to Bio1001 course. So one of the first things that was discovered in the 1800s was vestigial features. Vestigial features are features that remain in an organism but no longer serve a purpose. So an example of this is the appendix in the human. So we no longer understand what it is, and people can have an appendix removed and have no effects. They don't need to take any medicine. There's nothing that they need to do. So we really don't think that it has any kind of function today. But we believe that it once served a purpose because it costs a lot of energy to make an appendix and to keep an appendix going. There's blood that has to supply there. So there must have been a reason at one point why the appendix existed, but we no longer have a function for it today. So we have evolved to the point where we no longer need an appendix to function. So that is an evidence for evolution, because it must have been at some point that there was a function for it, otherwise it never would have existed. Another piece of evidence for evolution is the concept of homologous structures. So this was discovered by Darwin, and he found that there were structures in different organisms that seem to be very similar. So a really common example of this is the structure of bone in a human hand compared to the bones within a whale fin. So oddly enough, they have a very similar bone structure with multiple digits in the whale fin, even though obviously a whale fin is just one large structure that doesn't have any individual fingers. So what that told us that we understood from homologous structures is it must have been at some point there was a common ancestor that had the same bone structure with the 5-digit in a hand, and then slowly that evolved into different species. So one of the species that evolved was a whale, and another species that evolved was a human. And so because we had that same common ancestor, we share similar structures. So those homologous structures. So something that is similar from organism to organism. Darwin really provided us the biggest pieces of evidence for evolution. So one of the things that he really did was he gave us an explanation for a mechanism for how evolution could occur. And what he did, he called that descent with modification. Darwin observed that there was variation within those populations and that variation was heritable. So he was able to see that variation was being passed on from person to person. So if you think back to the lecture 2 video, I recommend you watch it if this is something that is new to you. There are a few things that are required for evolution. The first thing is that there must be variation within a particular trait. So let's use an example that Darwin saw, which would be finch beak length. So a finch is a type of bird, and they have different size beaks. So that trait must also be heritable. So it must be something that can be passed on from generation to generation. So that was something that Darwin saw with his the beaks of the finches, was that from one bird to the other, they were able to pass on their beak length. So those are two of the things that are required for evolution to occur. And then the third thing must be that there is non-random survival. So in the case of Darwin's finches, he saw that there was non-random survival of different beak lengths. So he found that there was a particular flower size that the birds like to feed on. And they had very thin flowers that were very difficult to get into. So the finches that had the thinnest beak length were able to best get at that food source. And so he found that they survived best because they had better access to that food. And then over time, he found that the common beak length that began to be present was the thinner beak size. So that was that concept of not only evolution, but also descent with modification. So there is a descent of a particular trait, so it is heritably passed from one generation on to the next, and that trait can be modified. So that beak length became modified towards a thinner beak. So that was the main component of Darwin's theory, which of evolution by natural selection or descent with modification. And he really was the main father of the theory of evolution and really provided us with the beginning pieces of evidence for evolution. But Darwin was not the first person to come up with the idea of an organism or species evolving. So there was another guy around the same time named Lamarck, and he came up with a theory where evolution was transformational. So a very common example used is he believed that if there was a giraffe and that giraffe throughout its lifetime slowly stretched his neck more and more and more so it could get up to the higher and higher branches and higher food, that then with that stretched out neck, it would then have a baby, and that baby would also have a stretched out neck. So throughout the lifetime of giraffe, it was able to stretch out his neck and then pass that trait on to its next generation. So that is what is meant by evolution is not transformational. So it's not something that transforms an individual organism to be better suited to its environment. What evolution is it is variational. So we saw that in the example with HIV in the previous lecture, where we saw that there was variation within an HIV population. And some of those variations gave the HIV the ability to evade certain treatments. In particular was AZT treatment. And because of that variation, there was a selective advantage to particular HIV particles. So the HIV particles that were able to evade this AZT treatment were able to then spread better. And so that is why we consider evolution to be variational. So it acts on variation within a population. It does not transform an individual organism, which is then passed on from person to person. So next thing that I want to introduce is the concept of fitness. And that applies to evolution and variation within a population. So thinking back to our HIV example, there was variation within the genetic code, and some of that variation gave individuals the ability to evade AZT treatment. So what we would call that is the HIV that carried the mutation that allowed it to evade AZT resistance had better fitness. So when we say fitness, we mean that it is able to pass on its genes to the next generation. That is the goal of all organisms, whether living or not, an HIV or a human being. The goal of life is to be able to pass on your genes to the next generation. If you think of a housefly, when they get to their final form and they're an actual housefly, their entire purpose is to have babies within a single day and then they die. Their lifespan is a single day and it is there only for them to give birth to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so we can actually measure fitness in that the more offspring that you have, the better your fitness. So in the case of our HIV example, the variation that gave the HIV the ability to evade AZT resistance had the highest fitness because they were able to produce the most offspring. So they were able to spread their genes much more than all of the other variation in the HIV that did not allow it to evade AZT and therefore did not allow them to continue to replicate and spread. So this concept of fitness applies to an organism's ability to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so the organism that has the best fitness is going to be the organism that is best suited to that environment. So that's where fitness and evolution by natural selection come into play, because evolution by natural selection selects organisms that have the best fitness, so the best ability to have offspring in that environment. But something that we need to keep in mind is that adaptation isn't perfect. So while in the example of the HIV that was able to gain some AZT resistance, that may give it the advantage in that when there's AZT present, it will now be able to continue to replicate, whereas the other HIV viruses that did not collect that mutation, and so therefore do not have that type of variation, are not able to continue to spread. However, that ability for the HIV to proofread and to evade AZT maybe now is going to make that particular HIV need more energy than the other HIVs. So even though now it'll be able to spread in the presence of AZT, it's going to require more energy from its host. And maybe that would kill off its host because it demands so much energy that it's not able to keep up with it. So you always have to consider that adaptation isn't perfect. So we can think of an example of a white hare that lives in a winter and there's snow around, and they have white hair, and that allows them to blend into their environment. But then the snow melts, and now there's green grass and dirt, and now their white coat very much reflects them in the background. So it's very easy now for a predator to pick out that hare. So even though in the winter time it's really good camouflage for that hare to be white, that makes it disadvantaged in the summer where now it is much more easy to spot it against the background. So there's always going to be a give and take of adaptation. And the reason for that is because adaptation arises from mutation. So any variation that we see in any organism arises because of a random mutation. So in the case of the HIV example, where we saw variation within the genetic code of the HIV particles, we saw that some of the HIV collected certain mutations, they collected a red mutation or a blue mutation, and all of those mutations did different things. But only one particular mutation helped it evade AZT. But in doing that, maybe it affected some other functions of the HIV that caused it to be a little less good. So there's always a give and take of adaptation, and that comes because adaptation derives from random mutation. So the animal doesn't decide that it wants to evade AZT. It just so happens that there happened to have been a random mutation, and that gave that specific HIV the ability to evade AZT. So another aspect of Darwin's theory of descent with modification, or theory of evolution by natural selection, is the concept of gradualism. So what that means is that populations will slowly change over time. This opposes Lamarck theory, where in a single individual's lifetime, they are able to change a trait drastically. Darwin's theory is that populations change very slowly over time. So there's a very gradual change from one species to another. So you can kind of think about this with humans and the concept that humans have evolved from similar ancestors to apes. So that's not to say that one day there were apes and then the next day there were humans. It means that there were very many, so the concept of gradualism applied to that is that there were many forms in between the ape-like ancestors and human beings, and that we actually can see that those different pieces are within the fossil record. So we have seen that gradually over time there is slow modifications to a population, and that eventually that may lead to a change in that organism. So now that is considered a different species. And so that concept is called speciation. So speciation is when a population has changed so much that it is now considered a different species. So this happens as a consequence of gradualism. So slowly over time, different characteristics evolve in a particular population living in a particular area. And eventually it accumulates enough changes and enough differences that we now consider it a different species. So that happened with humans. We see that there are many pre-humanoid fossils that we've been able to find, and they are different species from the humans that we have today because there are enough differences that they are no longer considered the same species. So gradualism eventually leads to speciation, where there are differences in the population, so much so that they are now considered a new species. So we've gone over the first aspect of evolution and how all organisms change over time. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the second component of evolution, which is that all organisms are related. So when we look at the evolutionary tree of life, we can see that if you trace your finger back through starting from any branch, you can draw your finger back and get to any other organism. So when you trace your finger to the middle, that is what we called the last universal common ancestor. So the last ancestor in which there was commonality from all branches of life, eukaryota, bacteria, as well as archaea. And that from there, it then diverged into those different branches of life. They believe that this last universal common ancestor existed about 3.5 billion years ago, or a little bit longer than that. And they believe that it may have been some sort of self-replicating molecule, such as an RNA or DNA, that was then able to evolve into cells and then divide into the variety of life that we see today. And that's lecture 2. So if you have any questions or things that you're unsure about this or any other related topic to biology, please visit biologybean.com, where you can find all of your tutoring needs. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and feel free to post some of your questions in the comment section, and I'm happy to start answering them.